Hi, everyone, and welcome to CCAG's Climate Conversation Series. I am Miti Jonel Tan, and I'll be leading our conversation today. Today's discussion takes place in the shadow of COP28, or the 28th UN Climate Summit that concluded in Dubai barely 48 hours ago. As Johan Rockström has said, the agreed text makes clear to finance business and societies that we are now finally 8 years behind the Paris schedule at the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel-driven world economy. But the text is worryingly vague with no convincing plan on how to transition away from fossil fuels and no accountability for the critical years ahead. So I would like to welcome our two esteemed guests, David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, and Dr. Fatima Denton, CCAG member and Director of the United Nations University Institute for Natural Resources in Africa. And perhaps I could invite you both to reflect briefly on the COP outcome before we turn our attention to the topic of our discussion.
Okay, so the COP has come and gone, I guess, and some of what we heard and saw, I think, was somewhat predictable. I think there has been some big shift. The very fact that we're talking about fossil fuel and moving away from fossil fuel, this is now something that we are challenging, that we've recognized as a problem, and that is now in the text. So I think that's a positive. But that said, I think that every delay in terms of fossil fuel, phasing out of fossil fuel, is to some extent a delay in climate justice, because there are people that are on the margins and the periphery that are really feeling the burden of climate change impacts. And those people do not understand the language that we use. They don't understand transition away or phase out or phase down. They see real impacts. They see degradation of their soils. They are faced with water stress. They are faced with problems related to energy poverty. They're in the front line, basically. So for those people, I think the longer we are in this sort of language, wordsmithing, etc., the more hardship it is for them, the more they face those burdens. But that said, I'm pleased to at least see that we have made some progress. We've called it what it is, and we're basically saying that there is a need to transition away from fossil fuel.
So my perspective is that the words are better, which is good, but the actions are inadequate, which is not good. And I think we have to think very hard as campaigners, as advocates, about the balance of our effort between getting words right and getting actions right. It's now 31 years since 1992, since the first COP, since the commitment to tackle quote unquote dangerous climate change, and it's actions that are missing. Now, obviously the words should be the pathway to action, but too often over the last 30 years, words have been a pathway to inaction rather than a pathway to action. And I feel it's very, very important that we focus on actions. Now, there were some actions in this COP. There were actions in respect of mitigation, including some commitments to funding, concessional funding. There were some commitments around methane, which are important. Methane is a particularly dangerous greenhouse gas. But in areas that my organization serves, we're a humanitarian organization that helps people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster to survive, recover, and gain control of their lives. We work in 40 countries like Sudan and South Sudan. We work in Afghanistan and Yemen. These are conflict states that are also climate vulnerable states, and they are notable for their lack of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, but also for their lack of financing for climate adaptation. And while I think it is important, it's good that this COP was the first one that had a recognition of the link between climate and conflict. I mean, it's pretty staggering that it's taken this long to get a day spent on it or a declaration. It's a voluntary declaration. I think it's signed by 70 plus states, which is good, but the test is the actions, not the words. I think there was an editorial somewhere which said that, and this is my last point, the COP was better than feared, but not as good as necessary. And that, I think, is quite a good way of putting it. And I think there are some quite harsh lessons for climate campaigners in this about what we focus on, how we focus on it, whether we're focusing on the right things.
Thank you, Fatima and David. I think those are very important points to make. Something that someone told me while we were there at COP was that it's like we're playing bingo with the COP text, with the final text. Like, this year we got fossil fuels. Last year we got coal. Next year maybe we got oil and gas. This year we got equitable. But then it's full of loopholes, like talking about carbon capture and storage and nuclear, and basically like a bunch of technology that's expensive and unproven, when the focus that we should be having is that fossil fuel phase out. And as Dr. Fatima was saying, it's so removed from grassroots, from the people most affected and impacted by the climate crisis, that to me, who knows climate stuff, and I've been in, this is my third COP, when we were first talking about phase down and phase out in COP26, I was like, isn't it the same thing? Like, what's the difference with a coal phase down and a coal phase out? Why is one word so crucially different? And yet it's almost deliberate that the words that are coming out of these texts aren't words that people will really understand and grasp. And it was really good to know, as David said, the very first time that we had a day specifically for climate and conflict, and there were also several official side events around war and climate, which is, I think, one of the first times that there was so many at this COP. And I was privileged enough to be in a few of them, where we talked about how it was kind of embarrassing how the U.S., for example, only pledged $17.5 million to the Loss and Damage Finance Fund, despite pledging like billions and trillions in military funding like every year almost. So, and I guess that brings us to our topic for today, the dangerous intersection of climate change and conflict. And during our climate conversation series, we have often discussed the far-reaching effects of the climate crisis, such as its impacts on global food systems and public health. But until now, we haven't looked into detail at how climate change can trigger and intensify geopolitical conflicts, often in countries which have historically contributed very little to the percentage of global greenhouse emissions. And so, David, you were already talking about it a little bit earlier, but Rescue has analyzed the challenges facing people in vulnerable parts of the world, and you identified 16 countries that are both most climate vulnerable and conflict affected. Could you elaborate on how these dual challenges uniquely affect the lives and livelihoods of the communities there?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So there are 16 countries that constitute 2% of global emissions that are conflict states, but they're also in the top quartile, the top 25% of the Notre Dame Index of Climate Vulnerability. And we know from the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, that fragile and conflict states are least likely by threefold to get investment in climate adaptation, even though they need it most. So there's climate vulnerability and lack of climate resilience. And people can visit rescue.org. It's the International Rescue Committee website. They can see our report. There are 4 points we make, and they're quite self-critical. I mean, they're points about how the humanitarian sector and the climate sector have failed to work together, even though our cause is common. I think we've done a bad job at making the case for risk mapping to be done at a granular level. People talk about states, but the truth is the south of South Sudan has a different climate challenge or a different set of weather patterns than the north of South Sudan. It's an obvious point, but risk mapping needs to be quite granular, quite community-based. Second area where I think we've got to do a much better job is innovation for climate adaptation in poor states. And I think that this is something where there's real essential need, both for climate security as well as climate justice, to take seriously the need for innovation. In our own way, we're doing that. We're trialing seed strengthening in northeast Syria. We're trialing farmer information systems in Ethiopia and Pakistan and Nigeria. So I think there's real innovation that's needed. I mean, one very practical example, we've just done an impact evaluation in northern Nigeria, which shows that the obvious point that if you give farmers cash in advance of a climate event like a flood, they'll use it to protect their livelihoods. And obviously there's a good case for loss and damage, but that comes after the damage. And anticipatory action, I think, is very important in this second category and is much under indexed. The third area is about how we meet the delivery challenge in fragile and conflict states. When governments are incapacitated or are combatants in conflict, it's different. You're not delivering climate adaptation in Switzerland. You're delivering it in a much more difficult set of circumstances. And I think that for institutions like the World Bank, which are absolutely critical to tackling global poverty, they're much bigger. They've got a much bigger balance sheet than any bilateral aid donor, but they don't work with civil society except in exceptional circumstances. And our argument is it needs to become the norm rather than the exception for organizations like the World Bank to be able to engage with civil society. Organizations like ours, international NGOs, can help, but I think there's a real imperative there. And we've suggested a set of decision rules about driving climate finance, not just into fragile states, but to delivery in fragile states through civil society organizations. And then the fourth area is about how one aligns climate finance and humanitarian finance. I think there's a real danger here that we end up in a robbing Peter to pay Paul situation, either between stable states and fragile states, or between climate finance and humanitarian finance, or between loss and damage on the one hand and adaptation on the other. I mean, there's a lot of danger here that we're robbing one pot to fill up another. And our report tries to set out some ideas on that, just to give you a sense of it. Humanitarian finance is about $50 billion a year. Climate finance, as you know, the $100 billion a year commitment looks like it's now going to be met. So those were the four areas that we tried to highlight in our report.
Thank you so much for that. And it really is a stark comparison once you've told us the numbers that are needed for adaptation, for loss and damage, for example, or climate finance in general, and then putting beside that the military spending that the world is putting in, and also really realizing that members of NATO, for example, I believe they are currently selling arms to 39 of the 40 most climate vulnerable countries, and 17 of which are already in armed conflict. And in those countries, if you zoom in even more, you will see that it's young girls and women who are particularly more affected by both climate change and conflict, because of course these two have a distinct and disproportionate impact on groups that already face discrimination. So Fatima, I would want to bring you into this and ask, how should we tackle this?
Thanks. I think we have to start at the source, or look at the root causes of the problem. For me, and I think this is actually very well documented, the climate change in itself is just a risk multiplier, but women and girls already face a great deal of problems, especially structural problems. You know, they tend to have a higher incidence of poverty. So tackling the problem, I think we would need to really begin at the source and to ask ourselves, what are some of the climate sensitive sectors where women and girls are most affected? If you take Africa, for example, this is very much a land-based systems, in the sense that most people for their basic sustenance. And so it's important to be able to map those risks in those climate sensitive sectors. Also, I think understand some of the inequalities related to both access and distribution, because very often, there are women-holder farmers, but many do not own land and have very little rights in terms of land ownership. So some of the inequities and inequalities start from there in terms of land ownership and access to land, and also access to critical information. For a long time, the climate science had not actually recognized or seen women in terms of a stakeholder group that are really in need of climate information and knowledge related to climate information. So for a long time, I'd say climate information services spoke more to men than it did to women. And women were not able to have access to spaces where this information was available. So they would not know, for instance, the strategic decisions that they need to take related to farming practices, or even in terms of how they adapt, the cultivars that they need to use, when to plant and how they may be affected by floods or by slow onsets. Those information were not available readily, I would say, because we saw climate change as a biophysical problem. not necessarily as a social vulnerability problem. And so many of the issues related to poverty were not very well seen or visible. We almost blindsided on those. So my sense is that we also need to look at issues around governance. David talked about fragility, but there's so many different scales and different levels in terms of fragility. There are fragilities that are related to systems, and some of the ones I've mentioned in terms of water system, agriculture, energy systems. But there is also heightened geopolitical insecurity as well, which also has an impact. When men, for instance, tend to sort of be co-opted into terrorist organizations, that has an impact for women, because it means that a lot of the work and the principal responsibility of looking after the family and the community is left with women. So they have to bear that burden. And there are governance related fragilities as well. All of these tend to have an impact on social groups like women. So I would say how we increase the capacity of women in terms of knowledge, that they are part of that sort of inclusive participatory process, where they're seen and they're heard, but also how we ensure that they are given the spaces that they need. I've mentioned issues related to land, but it's also about decision-making spaces as well. And also, I think the acknowledgement that this is also a social vulnerability problem, and therefore we cannot tackle climate change impacts related to these groups without looking at issues of poverty, because these two things are very much linked together. And most importantly, I think where women need information the most, especially in terms of climate information services, climate data, that we make room for them to be able to have access to that information so that they have greater agency. Because I think that's another problem. Smallholder farmers are very often invisible. They're not seen as entrepreneurs, actually, that have real stakes, that have business decisions to make. So they're sometimes discounted. So I think it's that agency and the inclusion process and how we ensure that they are able to be part of that decision-making process so that they can actually make decisions that are good for their farming, for their agriculture, for their community, etc., etc. So for me, it's really about recognizing where the problem starts, recognizing the structural barriers, ensuring that we're mapping the risk, and that these risks include some of the ones that we can anticipate also. And also being able to give women the space and the decision-making power, I'd say.
Thank you, Fatima, and thank you for really also reminding us of addressing the root cause of the issue, as you were saying about the landlessness of women. And there are plenty of studies showing that when women own the land, it becomes more planet friendly or environment friendly, because they know that it's something that we need to care about. And I believe David was talking about adaptation earlier, and really it's empowering women that we need to do when adapting, because women are the caretakers of the home, or the caretakers of the community. They are naturally the community leaders, because men are often at work in a lot of rural communities. And so the work that goes into adaptation usually comes from women. And I've spent a lot of time with both farming and fishing communities here in the Philippines. And a lot of the innovative responses to the climate crisis have come from women, where they've been forced to adapt without any structural support, because they are being impacted by the climate crisis. They will find a way to adapt already, and they will find a way to ensure that that the family, that the community isn't so vulnerable. So it really is that leadership that we need, and again, that ownership of land by the people who are actually farming the land. Going to my next thought, by the very nature, conflict and climate impacts are highly unpredictable. So for both of you, what is the best way to manage and respond to these sudden shocks in vulnerable communities? And how can we scale up the world's agility and capacity to act?
Well, first of all, Dr. Fatima spoke very well in the last segment, and I associate myself very strongly with what she said. I'm not sure you're right to say that a lot of climate crisis is unpredictable. Actually, I think we've got a lot more power to predict and anticipate. Obviously some things are unpredictable, but a lot of what we know about weather events is pretty predictable. And so I would argue kind of the opposite, that there's an imperative to obviously not put ourselves in a straitjacket as a result of the predictive analytics that are available now, but we shouldn't use the excuse that these events are random and they're hitting us from unexpected quarters. We know a lot, maybe not years in advance, but weeks are on our side in tracking weather patterns, in dealing with the consequences of El Nino. These are not bolts from the clear blue sky. These are quite these are predictable events, and I think that it's doubly wrong that the poorest communities are not able to protect themselves when there is knowledge that could help them protect themselves. And this is one of the aspects of climate innovation where I think there's room for public-private partnership. I think a lot of the talk about the private sector is not well founded when it comes to the poorest communities. It's going to need to be government money, public money, what in the World Bank terminology is called IDA money. So it's grants, not loans. But I think that we should get onto an anticipatory footing, not just a reactive footing. And this is something that obviously farmers who follow for decades and have passed down from generation to generation knowledge, they know it well. So what Dr. Fatima said about engaging local communities is very appropriate. I think that we mustn't make the best the enemy of the good. We shouldn't be trying to expect highly impoverished communities to be using triple AI on the most advanced high-tech connectivity and the rest of it. But I think we can do a much better job. The German government has said 5% of their humanitarian finance should be anticipatory. They're the only one that I know of that's made that commitment, and even a 5% commitment is pretty low. Now, it's a lot more than 0%, but I think we've got a whole mindset shift that this climate crisis, and I talk about climate crisis, not climate change, this climate crisis is evident, and there's evidence that is available to inform actions.
Thank you, David. I completely agree. I now reframe the question and say that for countries like mine in the Philippines, for example, we do know that the typhoon is coming, but we're not able to prepare for it, or the government simply does not put in enough or does not have enough finance to put into research and science and scientists to ensure that we have systems that will predict it well before the time that we need to be able to prepare for it in advance. And I believe, Dr. Fatima, you were talking about the access to information and knowledge earlier as well, especially to frontline communities. So I wanted to ask you if you've seen any successful stories or examples of this.
Yeah, I know that in the Sahelian region, for instance, when we've worked in places where we've made farmers aware of climate information services, we have seen better results in terms of their productivity. You know, they were able to produce more, and also the quality of their produce was better. In places like Kenya, for instance, in Turkana, we saw that when we aligned scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge together, we were also able to see some very innovative results in terms of the predictive. You were talking about predictive capacity, and farmers were able to predict with a great deal of accuracy what type of weather patterns they were able to have. But that was when we actually combined scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge. So it's also very important to find people at the place of things that they know, you know, so that we don't sort of reinvent the wheel. It's important that whether these are women or men, that they are in places where they're most comfortable with knowledge that they know. And sometimes, and maybe most times, I would say there is a tendency to see scientific knowledge as the ultimate knowledge, and that sometimes has a way of shadowing indigenous knowledge that has been tried and tested also for generations. So I think if you want people to come along with you in terms of adaptation and also to be confident with the tools that they have, you have to start with acknowledging their knowledge systems. And that's also very important. But I also wanted to talk about two things that, for me, I think what's most important right now in the climate narrative, and resilience has been a word that we've talked about a lot of times. But I sometimes feel that because we are so focused on mitigation and reduction of emissions, resilience gets diluted and lost somehow. But resilience is important because resilience can enable innovation. Resilience can enable adaptation. Resilience can also mean that you can be able to absorb shocks and stresses and then bounce back. That recovery potential is something you have when you are a resilient system. So I think we should really help communities build that resilience, because the higher their resilience, the more they're able to withstand some of these shocks and stresses. And also the more they're able to innovate. The climate debate and the climate narrative sometimes means that we are so focused on the global that we sometimes forget about the local. And that also means that innovation and innovative solutions are somehow overshadowed. We don't see them. Yet adaptation is not a response strategy that can happen without innovation. We have to be able to allow people to really adapt, but at the same time adapt with their own innovative processes. And that ability happens at the local level.
Thank you, Dr. Fatima. I think it's very crucial, exactly what you said, to acknowledge the indigenous and native knowledge that's present already. With my group in the Philippines, a lot of what we do is bringing students to frontline communities to learn from them, to learn from their practices, to learn from their resistance. The ones on the front line are often seen as victims. The front line of the climate crisis doesn't just mean front line of the impacts, but also front line of the defense. I think that's very important to really highlight. David, earlier you mentioned that we've been doing a bad job of bringing the conflict movement, like anti-conflict movement and the climate justice movement together. And something that I find that a lot of climate justice people don't really see and realize is that back in 1997, the US lobbied against military emissions being part of the nationally determined contributions to see if to report. So that's happened in the Kyoto Conference. And then in 2015, they removed the exemption, but then made reporting military emissions optional. So I wanted to ask you about what you think of that whole thing. I think there's only like 2 countries who voluntarily submit their military emissions in terms of the emissions reductions. And someone on a panel that I was on said very wisely that maybe the climate crisis is the thing that will finally get people to start to lower the military operations across the world. So I wanted your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think that if anything, it's the opposite, I'm afraid, because what we're seeing is that climate crisis is fueling resource stress, and resource stress is one of the things that fuels conflict, and conflict is feeding off the climate crisis. And put it this way, someone said to me at the COP meeting, tanks and bombs, they're not that much better if they're powered by renewable energy. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a bit of a danger of losing the wood for the trees here. I mean, the health sector I think is about 8% of global emissions, I think. I mean, that's a really substantial contributor. I don't know the figure for the defense sector, and it would be worth having it. And your points about 5%, is it that much? Seems high, but I'd be surprised, but maybe you're right. That's interesting. So there's a substantive issue there. But in the same way that I would say to colleagues, the health sector going renewable won't end the impact of climate on health. Let's not kid ourselves that the arms sector going green, so to speak, ends the problem. And so I'm rather looking at it from the other way round, which is that we're on a cycle now where the climate conflict overlap is growing. It's not universal. The war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, those are not climate-induced conflicts. But in a significant number of cases, the indirect impact of the climate crisis via resource stress is a conflict multiplier. And the point about these so-called civil wars that are in evidence in so many places, 55 civil wars going on at the moment, is that they're not confined within a single state, because as you see from Sudan, the consequences fall into neighboring states, Chad and South Sudan in that case, and they're increasingly internationalized with regional powers and sometimes global powers interfering. And so I think that the climate conflict interface that I'm really focused on is how to stop this vicious circle. Because even if all emissions stop tomorrow, even if there weren't 38 billion tons of carbon emissions this year, you've still got 100 years worth of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And so I think that's why our stress on climate adaptation, it's an interesting aspect of climate justice, this is important. I applaud what you're saying about transparency and making that clear. It's interesting what you say about the scale of emissions, but let's also not forget the bigger picture.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Dr. Fatima was saying earlier. Remember the root cause of it. And if you think of it, it's very silly to me as someone from the Philippines to think that military is the response to the climate crisis. And, especially because a lot of global north and wealthy countries, their idea is putting up borders as well as climate refugees start to come in. And that's why they want to avoid the climate crisis. And it goes back to the question of like, who makes our countries unsafe? Who makes our country so unstable that you need to quote unquote protect yourself from the military? Yeah, that's a really good point that you make about ensuring that we're not just greening the military, but really looking at the root of the crisis. And I saw you nodding earlier, Dr. Fatima, so maybe you wanted to bring something in as well.
No, I just wondered how do we define conflict? Because for me, resource depletion is a conflict. Ecological fragility is a conflict. And so, there are armed conflicts, of course, but I think we also have to look at the human security dimension as well. And that to me is also a source of conflict, because when people are trying their hardest to eke out a living and not making success out of that, and the environments that they rely on, the ecosystem, the services that they rely on, the services are no longer providing the goods that they need, that's a source of conflict, and some of these things are what triggers climate-induced migration, So I think we have to maybe widen the definition of conflict so that it's not just seen as armed conflict, but the other things that are causing resource depletion and stress are also potential disruption. And so it's these disruptive forces that we also have to put in that sort of wider basket of conflict.
Thank you for that. And I think David already brought in Ukraine and Gaza earlier. And when we talk about them, we have seen that they have been in Gaza, for example, at least they have been in a water crisis for so long, for decades, really. And the current war and the current occupation that has been happening for 75 years has only worsened that case. David, I wanted to ask you about something that you already mentioned earlier, but I wanted to learn more about it, about getting institutions like the World Bank to work directly with civil society organizations. And Rescue's research suggests that current rules in climate financing do prevent funding from reaching these communities. So, why do you think that's the case? What do you think can be done to change the existing systems? And how do we ensure that adaptation and that finance, and not just for armed conflict, but as Dr. Fatima was saying, resource conflict as well?
Yeah, this is a delivery problem more than a finance problem. I mean, sometimes the finance is pledged, but it's never spent, because the modalities for spending are too strictly linked to working through governments. And sometimes there are parts of countries where governments lack the capacity or the credibility or the legitimacy to be able to act. And if your listeners and viewers go to the rescue.org website and look for our emergency watch list, which was published this week, it lists the 20 countries with the greatest risk of humanitarian disaster next year, 2024. They'll see how we show in Somalia, for example, the World Bank projects are restricted in their scope because they're working only through government. And our argument is that we need to develop a much wider range of delivery options so that instead of it being the exception that the World Bank works through civil society, it becomes much more normalized. They do have examples in South Sudan, in Yemen, and in Afghanistan, but that really is only the exception that proves the rule. And obviously, when you're talking about loans, we're not talking about the World Bank doing loans to civil society organizations. We're talking about grants. I also want to make a couple of other points that you can't then treat civil societies like mini governments. They don't operate in the same way. We also in the NGO sector have to realize that there's no point in loading a burden onto a small local NGO. It needs to work in partnership with organizations. I mean, we're a $1.5 billion NGO, and we talk about the marriage of expertise, of experience and expertise from a global NGO with the experience and expertise of local NGOs. That's the 1 + 1 = 3 philosophy that drives our approach to partnership. It's not localized versus globalized. That's not a very helpful distinction. I think we've got to get the best of global infrastructure, global evidence, global experience, and we've got to get the best of local. And I don't use this phrase about capacity building. I think that's wrong, because that's a sort of patronizing way of thinking about it. I think local NGOs come with expertise and experience, and they don't need their capacity built about that. What they need is the partnership that allows their impact to be augmented and scaled. And that's what we try and do.
Thank you. No, that is, I think, the best way to describe how any movement should work, really connecting on the international level, on the global level, but also making sure to connect on the grassroots level. It's very interesting what you said about the World Bank dispersing grants and to ensure that civil society isn't treated as mini governments, because that's exactly not what we need. So I wanted to ask you both one last question. What are some of the solutions you would both like to see moving forward on conflict, on resource conflict, on climate, on all of these issues that all intersect with each other?
Let me start off by saying just the last point, that for me, resource efficiency, which this is very central to the problem we're talking about, it's not a monopoly of government. So I think that there are things that governments can also learn from civil society. And very often these things are about our organizational, and planning skills, because it's our ability to anticipate, but also our ability to plan. And we have an initiative that we're calling After Carbon as part of the United Nations Universities Institute for Natural Resources in Africa, because for us, it matters how countries plan in terms of a post-carbon economy. And the infrastructure they put in place, the knowledge infrastructure they put in place, the kinds of knowledge that would help them in making critical decisions on fossil fuel production, which is the case for many countries in Africa. I mean, we're not going to see the end of fossil fuel tomorrow, because many countries rely on fossil fuel for so many other things, not least social protection, and quite a number of other services as well that are provided through fossil fuel, including debt servicing as well. So my sense is that I think where countries are, especially in Africa, is their ability to be able to plan, to be able to anticipate these shocks that will come, some of the blind spots that we don't often analyze or we don't often see. Those are the things that they need to plan for, in terms of just staying ahead. I mean, this whole climate thing is a very difficult one, in the sense that it's very often difficult to be able to see far ahead. But that said, I would say that planning, building resilience, having clever maps in terms of risk matrix, those things would very much matter. But also to say that we have to go back to putting a lot of it more investment in adaptation. The sixth assessment report, the IPCC sixth assessment report, mentioned just how little monies are spent on adaptation, how little research also is spent on adaptation. So that we need the research, we need the investment, because, as I said, a lot of the innovation that we want would also come from adaptation. But right now, a lot of our attention is focused and fixated on the on mitigation. And countries that are in conflict, that are fragile, do not often see adaptation monies because they have to go through so many hoops, and by the time these monies come, it's not really going to serve their purpose. So I think we need to find a way of alleviating some of those administrative hurdles, bureaucratic hurdles, financial hurdles that, and governance as well, that countries face, and also to be able to recognize that communities can organize themselves, and that organization can also yield and produce some very successful outcomes. That it doesn't all have to be government based. So the more we can create these kinds of partnerships, I think the more we will be able to really open up more opportunities for climate adaptation.
Well, I think Dr. Fatima has spoken very well and really spoken for me. 15, 16, 17 years ago, I was Secretary of State for the Environment in the UK. And to talk about adaptation was almost like a surrender on mitigation. And it was almost not politically incorrect, but it was quite difficult to talk about adaptation without looking like you were giving in on mitigation. But the failures of mitigation mean it's essential that we talk about adaptation. And frankly, the failures or the failings of mitigation and adaptation are what's led to the necessity of talking about loss and damage. So you end up having people say you've got to walk and chew gum. You've got to walk, chew gum, and play the violin at the same time. Or if not play the violin, you've got to walk and chew gum and hum a Beethoven symphony at the same time. That's the challenge. And I think the way that she's framed it, the way that Dr. Fatima framed it, is very powerful. I think that I'd say one other thing. We're not doing a good enough job at taking the climate challenge out of the quote unquote environment box. It's still, General de Gaulle said, French president, wartime leader, he said that war is too important to be left to generals. And I used to say when I was the environment secretary, climate crisis is too important to be left to environment ministers. And that can get misunderstood. I think there's been progress. It's global leaders now who are addressing this. But there's still a temptation to call it an environmental challenge. It's not. It's an economic, political, security, social challenge. And I think that if you think about it, one of you used the phrase about systemic or systems earlier on, you've got to think about this at a systemic level. Now, the danger of that is it becomes impossible for anyone to get their arms around it because every system's too big for anyone to make a difference. But I think if we think about incentives and actions that result on them, you get into the guts of this. And what I said at the beginning about words are better, but words don't count. What matters is actions. There's a lesson for us. We've got to get into the incentives business and the actions business. And I think that has to be done not by seeing this as an environmental problem, but by seeing it as a living problem. It's how we live.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I often say that the climate crisis isn't just an environmental problem, as you were saying, but a problem that surrounds around people's lives. Like it is a matter of life and death. And people forget that one word, phase down, phase out, decides whether or not people live or die, especially in vulnerable countries, right? And I really like how you both emphasize adaptation so much, because it's true. Mitigation is so important, but adaptation is also something that will directly impact the people already impacted by the climate crisis today. And if we forget about that, we forget about the billions of people in the global south who are already affected by the climate crisis. And as you said, it is about doing it all at the same time. It's both how people put climate change in a box of environmental issues, but also people within the climate movement put us in boxes of mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, finance, not realizing that we need to do all of this together as a package. And we talked intensely earlier about the fossil fuel phase out and phase down, but I wanted to bring up at top also the language on global goal and adaptations, which is also a target of the Paris Agreement, which we were also reviewing this year. was very weak on languages and timelines and targets, and again, know how to get to the finance and the roadmap and how to double the finance that happened. So it does seem that we do have a lot of work on our plate, and it is about seeing those incentives, trying to see how we have those collaborations, as you both pointed out so well. So I wanted to thank you both, Fatima and David, for joining me today to discuss this critical issue. And I hope we can continue raising awareness and support for those in these dangerous environments. And thank you to everyone watching at home. Please spread the word and encourage further action by sharing our conversation with your networks. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.